Hey folks, come on in. Everybody get situated. We're adjusting our cameras and ready to get going in a second. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Introduction to beekeeping. We got Keto again today. He's our resident beekeeper and a lot of other things.
And coordinator for Sweet on Detroit, both beginner class, and we do a beekeeping club for members of the Garden Resource Program.
Yep. I'm gonna give people a couple more minutes to join us and then we can jump into our content today. Hope everybody is well. If you are new to Zoom, please find the chat box. We will use that to communicate questions. I have a few links that I'm gonna pop in there now, actually. Yeah, we use the chat box. Hey, Jackie's already in there. I'm gonna pop a few links in there that Keto recommended. Let's see. Hey, Kyle. You may have to copy and paste the links. I'll also, if you want to use them while we're in the class, I'll also send them via email to participants who registered and joined us today. All right, so if you're new to, go ahead.
Go. Well, just one other thing is that we'll also share. There's a lot of slides here today, and we may or may not get through all of them, but we're going to share the slides as well, so you'll be able to refer to those in the future.
Yep. Yes, Kyle, folks who may be new to this format here, we can't see you. Nobody else can see you. Your audio and video is muted. If you raise your hand, if you are on the line, you can raise your hand to ask a question and I can unmute you if you're calling in. If you're on your audio, I prefer you to throw your questions in the chat box. I'll monitor the chat box while Keto is going through the presentation, and I'll try to insert questions, as we go through the slideshow at appropriate times. If I think that the question will be asked later, I'll put a pin in it, and if it's not answered, I'll come back to it. So yeah, find the chat box. So if you're in here and you found the chat box, hey Tamara, hey Cindy, guys, welcome. If you found the chat box, can you just drop me a line and tell me how you're doing today? How you feeling? We finally got a good day to get out and garden. I got out there a little bit this morning, and I will be back out there this afternoon, hopefully. How are you feeling? Feeling good? Feeling okay? Feeling medium? I like that. Yeah, it's a lot going on in the world. Tamara, we're feeling great. Marcia's great. Jacqueline is feeling better. What's going on, Miss Fulbright? What's going on? Hey, Rich, good afternoon to you. Feeling good too? All right. Hey, Brenda, glad you're okay. I saw some pictures of your bees that Keto shared with me. That was cool, of your hive getting going. Yeah, okay, good. Cindy, glad you're feeling good. Yes, I'm excited too, Tanya. Okay, I'm gonna, for folks who are just coming in, I am gonna add those links one more time to the chat box. There are a few links with of good sites that Keto recommended for this topic. I'll also email them out along with the slides and the video recording of this toward the end. I'll ask that, you know, if you have questions, drop them in the chat box and we'll try to get to them. And then if you have questions related to the Garden Resource Program, like how do I pick up plants or where do I get compost or those kind of things, let's save those for the end. That way we can get through the content of the bees and then we can answer just like general GRP questions if that's cool. Okay, so before we get going, I do always want to see who we got in the room. So if you know me, you know we're gonna have to start with a poll. All right, who's in the room? Okay, I'm gonna launch this poll. Can you see it on your end? Is it showing up visible? My first question on the poll, you see it, Keto? First question is, are you a member of the Garden Research Program? You can chime in. Let us know who's in the room. Are you new? Are you an old member? Who's in the room? And then how familiar are you with beekeeping? This will help us with our, you know, drive our content, and we want to see, you know, how familiar are you with this topic? And then lastly, like, do you currently have hives? We want to see who's in the room. I'll give you a couple seconds to fill that out and we can see who's here. If you're just joining us, I see a couple people just popped on. We're doing a little poll to see who's in the room. If you could participate in the poll, that's great. And there's also some links in the chat box. All right, I think almost everyone has voted. 80% of folks have voted. If you want to jump in there, jump on there now. I'm going to stop it in a second. All right. All right, let's see where we're at. Can you see that, Keto?
Yes.
Okay, most people, it's a very mixed crowd of GRP members, non-GRP members, new people, old people. So that's cool. If you're new to the Garden Resource Program, welcome. This is a very, this is a really a jewel in the city in terms of resources available for you to start your garden. Folks who live in Detroit, Highland Park, and Hamtramck can sign up for the program with an application, and you can do that online right now. If you're interested in joining, folks who join get access to seeds and plants at different times in the season, and then all kind of extra resources like these classes, like access to our regional hubs with that are loaded with compost and things like that to help you with your garden. So if you guys have questions about the Garden Research Program, we can talk a little bit more about that later, or you can email us to figure out how to join. Are you familiar with beekeeping? Most people are just a little experienced or not at all. So this is good. This is the class for you. This is Introduction to Beekeeping. And if you are more experienced, you've gone through Sweet on Detroit. We have a few people. Danielle, our camera woman, is gone through the program. And I know Brenda and I know a few people that are on here have gone through the program. So if you have and you're able to jump in and kind of help with some of the questions, that'd be great. And then most people do not currently have hives. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions about, you know, how to get going. So let's go ahead and jump into the content if you're ready, Keto. I'll stop this.
Okay, terrific. Hi, everybody. Happy to be out here. We are out at the Keep Growing Detroit farm, right by where we keep our hives. I don't know, Danielle, Danielle's got it, the bees in the background in the shot. We just installed 2 new bee packages this week, and I'll talk about what that means, what's a bee package, in a little while. But we have currently 3 hives here, and one of which overwintered really nicely. So I expect to be doing a split off of that, and I can explain what that is later too. But generally, really excited to be out here today, talking to you guys about beekeeping and pollinators and a little bit on pollinators in general. So I just want to say that we got, I think I mentioned already, but we got a lot of slides that covers a lot of information. I'm gonna focus on the first half of the slides in particular, just familiarize you with some of the terminology, how bees, how bees function in nature, what they do, what happens inside of the hive, and then some of the tools of the trade for how to keep bees, and then, you know, how to set up a hive, all that kind of stuff. But I definitely encourage questions, and I'm going to try and round out my talking part to leave a little space for questions at the end. So I'm going to talk for a little while, go through the slides and some of this introduction stuff, and then we are actually going to go take a look in the hives as well, so you get to see some live action stuff. Hopefully that'll work out nicely. All right, so going on to slide 2. Why keep bees? I would say, you know, there's obvious ones. I think if you ask most anybody why keep bees, probably one of the first answers they're going to give is honey, which is definitely on our list here. But I really want to emphasize the importance of pollinators. And so bees, honeybees are one of hundreds of pollinators that do a lot of work for supporting our food system through their pollination services. So without, you know, even in the cold, wet spring that we've had, pollinators are already out in the world, bopping around from flower to flower, you know, being the churning wheels of nature, you know, making things happen. So they are something, you know, in many situations, well, and in particular, pollinators are challenged in a lot of ways right now. Honeybees in particular are having some specific issues around some particular pest pressures, and industrial agriculture has some pretty intense repercussions on honeybees. But a lot of pollinator habitats are being threatened by expansion of basically of destruction of natural habitats, and development, and kind of all these man-made things that a lot of it has to do with what we do, what we humans do, are kind of disrupting, and they serve a very important purpose. So our role as beekeepers is to foster, you know, not only to raise hives, but also to foster awareness about the importance of these pollinators and preserving their habitat. And there's some resources on habitat for other native pollinators, and that was one of the links, or the couple of the links that we shared with you at the beginning. Secondarily, that, you know, being a beekeeper causes you to have an acute connection to the flow of the season and nature, like what's happening right now. So for instance, folks got bees this week, and some folks got bees a few weeks back that were ready to be installed, and there was, you know, they were acutely aware of the cold temperatures outside and what was going on with the weather, so they knew what to do to be able to install the bees and make sure that they were good to go. So like, you're caring for this pet, so to speak, or this super organism, as it's called. You're caring for this hive, and you need to be aware of what's going on in nature, to know what's happening in nature relates to when you can split a hive, or when they have adequate nectar flow to be able to support themselves for the beginning of the season, because they're, you know, they have only so much honey that they stored from last winter, and are they running out? So it's a care related thing, but it's also, I find it a kind of a fun way of interacting with the natural world for that reason. And that kind of relates to the next one, observing and learning about these fascinating creatures. So we'll get into it, how the hive works a little bit more, but, you know, the hive is just a fascinating interconnection of how the queen mates and goes out and mates with drones one time in her life, and how bees make wax, and how bees make honey, and like every step of the way, and watching them festoon and doing a split, and watching a bee coming out of a cell for the first time. All those things, it's really fascinating stuff. And then on down the list, and I'll start. Let's go. We'll cover honey, propolis, pollen, and beeswax as I click through here. But I just want to mention raising queens and making new hives for a second here. So the short of it, without getting into the details, is that if you do get into beekeeping, it's not only for, there are other ways to support other beekeepers by raising queens locally and starting queens from and trying to establish bees that are really adapted to our climate and have good survival rates over the winter. And a lot of that can be done by raising bees in a local way. And there's a lot of demand for people who want to purchase bees that were raised locally, because most of the time we're getting these bee packages out of Georgia and California, because it's all connected to how the function of the pollination services around the country, and how that and then those companies also supply the majority of the bees that go around the country as well. So a lot of stuff saying there, but let's just keep going. Let's talk about, let's go down the list. Obviously, first on the list is for in terms of hive products would be honey. Honey is produced by bees collecting nectar from flowers. They'll travel up to 2 miles to find a good nectar source. If Danielle could pan around the field here, you could see a lot of one of the first flowers that bees really love right here is the dandelions out in the field here. Bees, and then they collect it and they ingest it into a special stomach that they have. It's a secondary stomach called the honey stomach. And then they come back to the hive, and believe it or not, they, when it's in the honey stomach, it gets combined with some special enzymes that help convert it into different sugars. And they put that inside, they regurgitate that into the cells, and then they fan the nectar until it reduces its water content, until it's shelf stable, so to speak, and then they can cap it, and then they have honey that will keep for an extended period of time. So that essentially, bees are creating honey for their primary food source, and that it is something that can keep for a very long time. There's actually reports of honey being found in tombs in Egypt that is still technically viable. So honey's and it's antiseptic and antimicrobial too. Honey is also unique to regionally. So there's many types of honeys. There's ones that come like the first flow of honey we're looking at here would be a dandelion honey. There's goldenrods, and you can get really specific sourwoods and star thistle and all kinds of different sources, and they have very distinct, unique flavors. Typically, Detroit honeys are considered, for the most part, wildflower honeys because we have such a diverse array of flowers in our open spaces. And so they have, but at a bee club meeting, we might have people bring honey, and if you taste 2 or 3 of them together right next to each other, they might have distinct differences. One will have maybe hints of mint, for example. Going on, propolis. I'm going to start moving a little bit quicker because I know I got a lot to cover here, and I want to spend a little more time on the later stuff. Propolis is something that bees collect to use as a disinfectant inside of their hive. It's somewhat of the paint and caulk of the hive. Bees collect propolis from tree resins and saps, and they use it to create a sterile environment inside of the hive. It is also something that we can use as an antimicrobial, antibacterial. For instance, it's used in toothpastes And you can make a tincture out of it where that works really great for sore throats, as an example. Next, moving on, is beeswax. So beeswax can be processed out of spent comb after you've extracted the honey, and used for making everything from candles to, you can use it for products like lip balms and salves. And it smells wonderful, and it also can be used like old school, like to seal jars and stuff like that. That's what they used to use for sealing jars, was that with the wax rim. You can also use it to prime screws when you're drilling, making holes so you don't split the wood. Okay, next. Moving on, getting started. So apologies that the slides are a little bit off center here. That's what happens when you put a PowerPoint into up on Google. It just the formatting got messed up a little bit. Hopefully when you guys download it, you can see it a little bit better, but I'll summarize this anyways. I wanted to put this out front somewhat because beekeeping ain't no joke. It's a really awesome hobby and a really awesome way to contribute to the natural world, but it's also not cheap, and it's not cheap to get started. So I just wanted to give you some sense of what it costs to get started. So to order bees is somewhere between $120 and $180. A package would be a box that looks like this. If you can see look up at what I'm holding up here, is about the size of a shoebox that you would get bees ordered. You order them at a specific time, usually between December and February or March, and you pick them up usually in April or May. So this had 3 pounds of bees in it. The other option is it coming in a nuke or a nucleus hive, which is a small hive starter. And then for hive equipment, if you look over at the stacks of equipment over there, so each one of those boxes, usually you can get a kit that is 5 of the smaller boxes high with a bottom and a top, for right around 150 bucks, give or take. And so that includes the boxes, which we call supers or high bodies. And then the frames, which are, Danielle, if you could, yeah, that's an example of a frame, which is essentially, for each one of those boxes, there's 10 frames inside, and that's what the bees build out their comb on. So that comes with all that stuff. Protective gear, there's different kinds of protective gear. This is one example of a jacket veil combo. I like this because it's really lightweight and pretty easy to just keep around. So veil, you usually need to have some kind of head covering. There's different types of veils, and then gloves. These are a glove with a long gauntlet to cover your arms. So that hovers in around $30 to $100. And then tools would be, the main 2 tools are a hive tool and a smoker. And all right, so we can go back to the slides. So all told, we're looking at an initial investment of somewhere around $400. And actually, it might even be slightly more than that, because usually we recommend that people start out, if they're able to start out with at least 2 hives, because there's a lot of challenges that we deal with when keeping bees, and odds of losing a hive are pretty risky. There's a lot of things you can do to make sure that they don't happen, but it is possible to lose a hive. And so if you have 2 and you lose 1 in the next season, you could split one of them into 2 again. There's a way to take a hive and split it in half. So that's just kind of the nuts and bolts, brass tacks of what it costs to kind of get started. So let's keep moving. I guess take 1 second. Do we have any questions thus far?
Just is so. Do you need to purchase 3 pounds per hive, or?
Yes, correct.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And then is that cost every year?
In theory, no. I mean, like, we're trying to, and that's partly, you know, we are really trying to, as a beekeeping club, we're trying to encourage a lot of best practices to avoid hive losses over the winter, but it's not easy. And it really it requires paying particular attention to dealing with pest problems, and like this varroa mite. But in theory, no, you don't. It's a one-time investment for all the hive equipment and the tools and stuff. That's a one-time cost.
Mm-hmm.
And then the bees is something where you have to assess from season to season. If you want to expand your bee yard, well, then you need to purchase again. Your bees made it through the winter, then you're golden, and maybe even you can make a split and sell it to somebody.
Yeah.
In theory, I mean, and then in just terms of like return on investment, once a hive is established, you could expect to harvest on a good hive between 50 and 100 pounds a year. That's not guaranteed, but if all goes well, I would say at least 50 pounds from a hive. And if you sold that honey, you can get $1 an ounce. So you can get some money back if you are strategic about it. But it is very much a labor of love.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That was it. Want to go to the next slide?
Next slide, yes. Okay, I just put this in there for those. I know this is, pollinators in general, as I mentioned at the beginning, are very important. And in case you got sticker shock at the last slide, there are other ways that you could support pollinators. One of which I didn't mention here is just supporting other beekeepers, whether that's buying honey from them, or, I think there might even there could be a model of doing a honey share where you help contribute to startup costs for a bee yard, and you get honey back, or some kind of return on your investment. So there's possibilities. But I also wanted to say, mention these few resources that MSU put together that are really nice resources for both. The first one is plants and that attract beneficials and pollinators, and a rundown of, it's got some really great spreadsheets on varieties of plants and the pollinators that they attract and the time that they bloom and all that kind of stuff. It's also, this also serves a really great purpose to our vegetable gardens, because it's, having a diversity of insects in our garden helps diminish the ability of one to dominate. So diversifying populations prevents a singular one from taking over too much. So that can serve purposes around pest issues, insect pest issues in the garden, because some of these beneficials that you would be attracting are parasitic to pests. And then there's a second resource here on creating habitats for native bees. So there's ways to create little hive-like structures with some simple pieces of wood, or like taking a piece of wood and drilling holes in it for mason bees, and there's some other ones for carpenter bees. So there's different ways to create habitat that are highlighted in that article as well. Okay, next slide. So what is happening? So Danielle's panning over to that hive over there again. And what is happening inside of this hive? So at the height, so when we get these bees, the ones that we just got, there were about 10,000 bees in that 3-pound package. But the average population of a healthy hive is somewhere around 60,000 bees. And they function as what is called a superorganism, which means that they cannot live without each other. And so, like, the queen cannot live without the workers. The workers, or the drones can't live without the workers. And the workers, none of them can work without the queen. And, we'll talk about drones, but drones are needed to, those are the males, and they're needed to create sperm for the next generation, amongst other things. So essentially, bees are, in this newly established hives that we have here, are setting up shop. I set up, and they initially had something that looked maybe similar to this, where there's either a partial piece of foundation or a full sheet of foundation, but there's no comb on it, okay? And so they're drawing out comb because they can't lay eggs until they draw out comb, and they can't draw out comb without nectar. So they're going out and they're collecting as much nectar as possible. They're filling their bellies, they're getting some energy, they're drawing out comb, and then ultimately, then the queen, once they have some queen, so the comb drawn out, then the queen can start laying eggs and then build the population, and then the system starts to work together. So they're just kind of getting themselves rolling today, rolling now. And I put some drawn out comb from a previous year's hive in there, so they would be good to go to get started. But in terms of the flow of the season, here in Michigan, bees are basically collecting nectar to make honey to serve as their food for the winter. So they're spending, now they're just kind of getting started. They'll have a time when they'll have a procreation, so to speak, period, where oftentimes it's called swarm season, where the hive that is overwintered, once the spring warms up enough, in the next coming, at probably beginning of May till about June, is our swarm season here, which is the natural impulse of the hive to make a new hive, to split off. What happens is the queen will lay another queen cell, a cell that will hatch out only a queen, and then she'll take half of the bees and go try and find a new home. And then she'll leave her daughter and the rest of the bees behind to thrive. So, with us as beekeepers, we're gonna try and do things so we might force a split or force a swarm, so to speak, so we can capture those hives, that half of those bees, and keep them for another hive. But if we don't, then they're going to go off and try and find somewhere in nature, which in Michigan doesn't always work out so great. but so they start up the season, start raising babies. There's a swarm season, and then through the rest of the season, their goal is to make enough stores to have enough for the winter months to survive, and start it all over again. So the honey flow season here in Michigan is usually June, May, June, July, and then if July gets a little towards the end of July, it will tend to get dry, and August will tend to get dry, and so that's when the nectar flow tapers off, and then there might be another nectar flow depending on our season and how it goes in the fall with goldenrods and things of that sort. And then usually July and August, bees they're starting to raise what are going to become their winter bees. The bees that are going to survive in the hive over the winter months and keep the queen alive. So that's kind of a general picture, and I'm going to get into some more of the details as we go on.
Wow.
I know it's a lot.
It's a lot. So from, if you're starting off now in the season as a new beekeeper, the question is, how long does it take to actually get honey? Would you get it like the first season, or does it?
Yeah, well, you can get honey in the first season, but usually we encourage folks to focus on treating a brand new hive like a newborn baby, and nursing it along in the first year, and trying to get it over the hump of building up a population and becoming well established in that first season, and expecting to harvest honey more so in the second season. Does that mean that you can't harvest some honey from the hive in the first year? No, you can usually get up at least 5 pounds in the first year, take out a frame or two. That's not usually a big deal. And if the bees happen to take off really well, and we have a terrific honey flow season, and you're just throwing a honey super on there one after another, then maybe you could have a harvest in the first year.
Okay.
But the first and foremost, we want folks to focus on getting them through that first season.
Okay. And then Carla is asking, like, so if you don't harvest the honey, is that gonna like be harmful at all?
No.
Like if there's overflow?
No, but we're always managing to make sure that the bees have enough space to work with. Okay, so if you look at the boxes on the left here, and you see 3 boxes, but the one on the top is just open. I'll kind of illustrate it a little bit more later when I take it apart. But basically, we're starting this hive with 2 boxes. That third one is just open because we had a feeder on the top. So we're always, we don't want to, when we start a new hive, we're not just stacking up 10 boxes and saying, okay, good luck, fill out that space, and I'll be back at the end of the season. I'm going to grab your honey. The bees need to be encouraged to fill out new space, but if there's a bunch of open space, then they won't. They'll be overwhelmed and won't be able to fill out, and they'll draw out a bunch of random comb. But so we're starting them out with those 2 boxes. Once they filled that out with brood and honey and pollen and so on and so forth, then we move on to, we add a super and encourage them to move up into that space. And so by the end of the season, we'll be up to 5 or 6 supers high. The ones at the bottom is where the babies are, where they call it the brood chamber. And then above that would be where the honey stores are. All right, any other questions? Keep moving.
Yeah, we can keep going.
Okay, and then one more thing before we kind of get into this. Actually, this is a kind of an appropriate time to talk about this video. So usually at the beginner class, I like to show this video because there's some really amazing cinematography of the inside of the hive, and you get some great visuals of the hive, how the hive works. So on Daily Motion, I found a link to it for free. So check out this video on this link when you get a second. It'll be your later time entertainment. All right, next slide. Okay, so who are these cast of characters? Let's get into a little more of the details. Can anybody tell me who is the imitator and who is the honeybee here? Oh, I'm sorry. T, click to the next slide, please. Okay. Nope, go back one. There you go. Nope, back.
Sorry.
You're going the other way. Okay. All right. So where's the honeybee and who's the imitator? Anybody?
Who's the honeybee and who's the imitator? Anybody want to guess? You can throw it in the chat box. Is the honeybee the one on the left, the one in the middle, or the one on the right? Natalie is guessing the first one is the imitator.
Yeah.
And then someone said the middle is the actual honey bee. Is that right?
Yep. Correct.
Wait a minute. These folks know what they're talking about, Keto.
Okay. So the one on the right is a hoverfly. So it's not even related to the honeybee at all.
Mm.
The one in the middle is a honeybee, and you can partially tell that because it's fuzzy. And the one on the left is a yellow jacket. And this is another thing I wanted to bring up as something that we folks in the know need to share with other people, because a lot of people say they conflate yellow jackets is what's on the left there with honeybees.
Yeah.
And when they're out at having a barbecue and there's this yellow jacket flying around their hot dog, they're like, "Oh, these bees! I hate these bees!" And it's not a bee.
Right.
And it gives bees a bad rap. Yellow jackets are scavengers and carnivores, and they're going after anything with sugar or protein. And so that's why they're super annoying, and they will be all up in your stuff when you're out having a picnic. But honeybees, for the most part, will not. They don't really want to come in contact with humans. They don't have much reason. They will go after. They'll go after water. So sometimes you'll see them in puddles or like water resources, pools, occasionally in pools. But they're not really going to bother you unless you bother them. So they're for the most part, outside of the hive and seeing them on flowers, the bees more or less keep to themselves, and they don't get defensive unless you're. They really don't get defensive unless you are going in the hive. And let me. And that's not a cause to not go in the hive, but they're more they're protective of the hive. But we have precautions for that. It's partially why we wear the protective veils and such.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, keep going here. Any questions?
Yeah, I know you're gonna get into the characters of the queen next. So Jackie, here's a picture of the queen. And then Aisha says, "Are you familiar with Flow Hive? Do you have any opposition to that system?"
Yeah, I am familiar with the Flow Hive. I think it's too complicated, and there's like it's got moving parts that like basically bees. Some people swear by it. Um, Jackie Fulbright, you'll have to just Google it. It's a phenomenon right now. The short of it is, sure, maybe some people can make it work. I think maybe in other climates it might work a little bit better. Like, but like equipment is expensive as enough as it is, and I don't know how much a flow hive is, but I know it's at least $100 more than the standard beekeeping equipment. And I just think it is, it's just another, like, it's beekeeping is complicated enough, and it just adds another layer of complication on how you do management. It doesn't, I wouldn't recommend it. Some people do, you know, there are beekeepers out there that think it's a great tool. I'm not in that camp. We'll leave it there.
Mhm.
Okay.
And then do the yellow jackets harm beehives or not?
Yellow jackets will try to get in and get to the honey inside a hive. Usually a strong hive is able to fend them off pretty easily. But a super, you know, like because yellow jackets don't travel in groups. They're usually ones or twos, maybe threes, and they're kind of operating on their own. Okay, so here are the main cast of characters that are living inside of a hive. Workers on the left, they are actually the smallest of the three, even though they do the majority of the work of the hive. Those are the females. Drones in the center, notice the big eyes, and they're kind of chubby. Those are the males. And the queen on the right. Queens have a long abdomen. And so now we're going to go to the next slide, and we'll kind of break down bees, the queen. So typically, a hive has one queen. There are some unique cases where more than one queen will be in a hive, but generally speaking, we should only anticipate one being in there. The queen functions, one of her main functions is her pheromones, her perfume, her scent is one of the things that helps keep order in the hive. So her presence as a mother, as though the one who's laying eggs that are proliferating the line, the population that represents the future of the bees. So she gives off pheromones that basically makes the rest of the hive say, all's good. We just need to do these things, but we are functioning as normal. She helps, from her sense, her odors help keep things in order. This is the third statement here is a slight misnomer. The queen is the only bee in the hive that lays eggs. If the hive ever goes queenless, there is an impulse of other females to fill that void, even though they are incapable. The laying workers are only able to produce drones. So it's a complication. So basically, we're trying to not let that happen. Make sure that the hive is always queen right. And the queen is laying eggs, 1,200 to 1,500 eggs a day. So she doesn't even feed herself. All the other workers feed her. And she's kind of working nonstop. When a new queen is hatched out, before she starts laying eggs, she will go on, 1 to 2 mating flights. She'll go out, and there's a really interesting thing. So the drones, the males, there's what are called drone congregation areas, where it's basically like the bar, where all the dudes hang out, and then the queen goes out to meet up with some drones, and they do their thing in flight sometimes, and then the drone dies once all his sperm is put into her spermatheca, uh, which is a special sac that stores enough sperm for the rest of her life. So the queen mates once, or roughly once, with a couple of drones for her 3 to 5 life year span, where she lays 1,000 eggs a day during the growing season. So that's millions of sperm. It's crazy that's possible. And all right, moving on. She has a long abdomen. The differentiation between a queen and workers is essentially that a female egg, or an egg laid by another queen, is fed royal jelly. So the bees are specifically feeding this cell royal jelly, and that gives her the stuff she needs to develop into a queen. And there's a special a type of cell that she grows in that points up and down and looks kind of like a peanut. So that being said, you can raise queens by taking worker cells and figuring out how to orientate them up and down, and the bees will treat them like queen cells and feed them royal jelly and develop them into queens. So we are now on the slide that says queen eggs are tiny white specks at the bottom of the cells. You got that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay. So she's laying these eggs constantly, and then after they're laid, the workers will come in and start to tend to them and feed them until they develop large enough to pupate, and then they cap the cells, and then they develop into mature bees and hatch out. Next slide. The queen does have a stinger, but she only uses it when she is battling another queen. So if another queen cell if a hive has 2 queen cells, then the existing queen, whoever hatches out first, will either try and kill off that other cell. So there's a domination here that the queen, generally speaking, only wants to have 1 queen in the hive. And I know that's a little bit confusing because I was talking about earlier about the mother-daughter relationship with the swarms. But if there's an introduced queen situation where you're combining 2 hives that both have a queen, for instance, because one hive is weak or something, then one of those queens has got to go. They won't both be able to stick around, and they will have a battle, and one will sting the other ultimately and pare it down to 1.
Yeah. So question then there is, if you have no intervention, how many queens will be produced in 1 season, I guess?
I would say if a hive is swarming, a queen will be produced at that time. So that would be the only time naturally that's happening, is during the May-June timeframe when the hive is procreating. It's making a new hive.
Mm-hmm.
If I But if I wanted to raise some queens, I would take, and I'm going to just, the quick and dirty explanation is I could cut out a bunch of cells, put them on frames pointing up and down, and put them in a hive to encourage those bees to develop them into queen cells. So I could raise 100 cells in a hive. I just have to make sure that none of those hatches out before the other ones, because they'll kill the rest of them.
Right. Okay. And then I see Cindy, I see you raising your hand, and there's a few other people that raised their hand. They're call-in listeners. Are you okay with me interrupting right now? You want me to say those to the end, Guido? If they're calling in, they can't get in the chat box, so I can allow them to talk.
Sure.
Okay, Cindy, if you're ready, you can ask your question. You're unmuted. Cindy, are you there? Okay. Okay, maybe it was a mistake. So if you're calling in with your phone and you're calling in, you're not watching the video, you can raise your hand if you have a question, and I can take you off mute. If you're not calling in, definitely best to use the chat box for a question. Okay, we can keep going.
How are we doing on time?
We're at 1:56.
Okay. So let's move on to drone bees. Drones are males. Their main objective is to diversify the genetics, so to speak, and mate with queens of different lineages. They also serve, because they're larger bodies, they serve a function to regulate the temperature inside the hive. They do not have stingers. They have large eyes because that helps them to find the queen when they're out on their mating flights. They do not feed themselves. So they hang out in the hive, the workers feed them, they go out to the drone congregation area, they mate with the queen, and then they die, or they keep, or if they're still hanging out back at the hive, they're helping regulate the temperature inside. Next slide. As I mentioned, queen can mate with up to several drones on her mating flight. Next slide.
Quick question, I know you're going fast. Hannah was asking, the drones you said are going to diversify. What were you meaning by that? They're going to diversify the pool?
The genetic pool? Right, so it's not like, there's basically drones, there's drone congregation areas, and like this is kind of a, there is some science that has studied this, but they don't know exactly how it works, but drones from different hives will congregate. So basically you're like, just like we don't want to mate with our children or our cousins, because that would negatively affect the genetics of our progeny. Genetic diversity is really important. And when the bees go out and mate with, they mate with, the queens go out and mate with drones, they're coming from a couple different sources. Is a to create that genetic diversity.
Okay, got it. We got it. Thank you for clarifying. Yeah. So you want to be on this slide, drone bees?
Next, drones live around 90 days.
Gotcha.
Okay. So, and then at the end of the season, drones are kicked out of the hive. And so they basically kill off the drone population for the winter months because they're slimming things down to essential workers of the worker bees and the queen. So they have a crazy life, those drones. Moving on to worker bees. Next slide. Worker bees are all females. They typically do not, and as I mentioned earlier, they typically do not lay eggs, but they do most of the work of the rest of the hive. They do all of the functions. So let's highlight those. Go to the next slide. So the worker, when they're hatched out, they will start working inside of the hive, nursing other young bees, and serving as the security at the front of the hive. And then after 21 days, they'll begin foraging for nectar, water, pollen, and propolis. And ultimately, honeybees live for 30 days, unless, like I had mentioned earlier, they are winter bees that are raised at the end of the season, which winter bees have more fat bodies and are raised specifically to last through the winter months. Their metabolism slows down with the cold weather. Next slide. Here is a visual of the general honeybee life cycle, which is queen lays an egg in the bottom of the cell, and then the larvae develops into, and the worker bees continue to feed that larvae, and it develops bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's capped after a certain amount of days. It's capped, and then emerges, a few days later. So I think between workers, drones, and queens, I think workers are 21 days to develop. Drones are slightly longer. I think they're maybe 24, and I think queens are slightly shorter. And there's a specific correlation with the development of drones and workers and this pest problem, because these mites get inside of the cells right as they're about to be capped, and then they have enough time to expand their population. So there's things to know, and there's also, this is important to know, to learn about with the days to development, because that's, if you're raising queens, that's really important things, knowledge to know.
Mm-hmm. And the queens are the only one laying eggs. They're laying eggs that are workers and drones, right?
Correct, both, yes.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. So how much time do you think we have? About 20 minutes?
Yeah, if you want to break for questions, but I think 30 minutes wouldn't be bad.
Okay. So let's move on to protective gear. I'll just kind of summarize this. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but essentially, this is a type of veil that can be worn independent of a jacket. The next slide is full suits with veils. Our friends Jackie and Rose are in there.
Let's say there go Jackie.
And then I mentioned gloves. Moving on, skip. All right, hive equipment. You know what? I think at this point, I'm gonna say, review. You got a lot. There's still 30 some, at least 30 some slides to go through here with a lot of self-explanatory information.
Okay.
I do want to spend some time opening up the hive, because I want to check on, make sure our queens got out, and give you some visuals to work off of. So let me just spend a minute getting set up, one quick minute getting set up with my veil on, and let's open up these hives.
Great. So I'll email the full slideshow so that you can go through them yourself. And of course, as always, if you have follow-up questions afterwards, we can definitely accommodate those via email. So I'm gonna put the Yeah. Can you still hear us, Keto, while you're putting that
Yep.
on?
Yep.
So can you talk a little bit about what KGD is offering this year? Are we offering kits? Are we supporting people purchasing at all? I know we have a different year this year. And then you want to talk a little bit about Sweet on Detroit while you're.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me just say that first off, the beginner class that we do is we specifically set it up to give you to learn about beekeeping and get some experience with beekeeping without making the investment, without like before you spend the money to buy that stuff and get the bees, to learn about, kind of understand what you're getting yourself into. And that said, the timing of, at this point in the season, it's more of, it's kind of getting late in the season to even get bees. Typically you would get bees, you would order bees in December through March and get them now at this time of the year. We support beekeepers with just with technical assistance on sourcing, where to get bees from, where to get equipment from, how to put it together, how to install the bees, all of that kind of support stuff. And just, being available for technical assistance when troubleshooting problems and that kind of thing. We do not supply hives or hive packages at this point. We don't have the resources for that. And then if you are keeping bees, we have a club that meets monthly, and we're still kind of formulating what our plan is going to be for this season under the circumstances of COVID. But I think we're going to probably do some Zoom check-ins, and maybe even try and have a few guest speakers virtually. But definitely are available for talking things through. Any other questions?
Hope we're doing good. Hopefully you guys can see Keto well. We're gonna get in those hives, so made this screen big. You can play around with your view options. You can be in gallery mode or view mode. So do its best so you can see these hives so we can get in there.
Okay, so just this week on Monday night, Danielle and I came out here and installed 2 3-pound packages, which was basically 3 pounds of bees in here, and then the queen in a little cage. The queen came in something that looked kind of like that. So we said, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the queen got out. That's one thing that we need to do right here. So we're going to check out on that one, this hive and that one, which were the 2 hives that we just put packages in. And then we're going to take a look at inside of this hive and see how things are going. If we have time, I might switch that up a little bit based on how we're doing with time. Okay, she's out. Yay.
Yay. If she didn't get out, what would you done?
I would have tried to open it up for her. There's a way, there's basically a little candy. Oh, hold on a second. There's a little candy in the edge of the cell. And then, here, I'll show you in a second here. Straighten that. All right, I think to give you guys a little bit more visual aid. All right, well, first to answer that question, you open up, you pull out a cork in the bottom of the cage, and the bees will eat it through to let the queen out. And if she doesn't, if you come back a few days later and she isn't out yet, then you can pull out a cork at the other end. Why you wouldn't do that initially is sometimes the bees are not as acclimated to this queen since the way that they put these packages together. So this gives them a little time to get more acclimated to her pheromones, and not have any complications. So I'm gonna open this. I think we'll spend a minute opening the center hive because this will be a better way to see some of the action. So typically I would be using a smoker when I'm opening a hive. So again, kind of referencing the tools. The hive tool, as you've seen me this is a really necessary tool for prying the supers apart and moving frames, and because a lot of that propolis is causing everything to stick together. The smoker is a tool for pacifying the bees, essentially. You puff smoke on the bees, which causes them to have the instinct like there is a forest fire. So they will usually eat some honey, and because they're getting ready to potentially take off if the risk is increased. So that one prevents them. It makes them slightly more docile. The smoke also blocks the pheromones. So any kind of the bees, a lot of their communication, not only by understanding that they're queen right with the queen being present, but they communicate with each other with pheromones. So when they're giving, they may give off if there's a sense of a threat or danger, they may give off a particular pheromone that there's a threat or danger, and the smoke also helps mask that. So if I smell bananas, then I know that I probably should close up the hive and be done for the day. That's just one of the pheromones that they give off, smells like bananas. But I'm gonna give it a shot. You don't always have to use a smoker. It's just a tool, but we're gonna, just to keep it slightly more simple, we're not gonna use a smoker right now. And I'm just gonna open up and take a look at what's going on.
Okay, a couple questions while you're opening that. What's the best resource to get those smokers? Make it.
There are companies beekeeping suppliers. There's a few somewhat locally, but there's Data, there's Better Bee, let me talk about recent, remind me to come back and talk about conferences and stuff, because that's
Okay.
probably the best time to get that kind of stuff.
Okay. And then Brenda is saying she has one super with frames, one super with frames out per hive. The top one is empty. Should she add another one?
What's the question again?
She says she has one super that has frames out per hive. So basically her top
Oh,
is empty. Um, should
it's
she
got
add
9
another?
frames. It's got 9 frames.
Let me know, Brenda. You're gonna have to add on to that question. And then what do you put in that smoker to make it? Are you using like wood, leaves, or pine needles, or like?
Right. Yeah, anything that'll burn and cause smoke. So cedar wood chips work really great, but I usually just grab whatever I can find. I'll use this. I've used this straw from this hay bale. Whatever works.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
You can use, sumac berries. You can use sage. You know. Okay, so at the top here is a nice developed frame of honey. It's really dark because the comb is a little bit older, and it gets dark over time after generations of bees being raised in it. Um, and I'm gonna get down to show you where I'm gonna put this back because I know, well, so generally speaking, I'm using my hive tool because propolis causes everything to stick together. And so I'm trying to get over and get a general sense of what's happening in this top super. So usually I remove an outside frame and then come over and yeah. I just want to make sure that that the queen is laying or starting to lay. I'm looking for the presence of eggs or brood.
Would you actually see the white flake that you were talking about, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
yes.
Okay. And then Brenda, just to come back to her question, she says she has 10 frames. The top super has no frames, just the syrup for feeding. Should she add another super with frames or not?
How many? Okay, let's put it this way. If she doesn't have drawn out comb,
Mm-hmm.
then she should have one super, and then on top of that super, the inner cover, and then sugar feed on top of that, and then an open super around that and then give them a time to draw that out. And then think about adding the next super. Hopefully that helps.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Do we have any honey available right now? Someone asked, Sharon.
Yes. We have some honey from last year still. Yeah.
Brenda said that makes sense.
Okay. All right. These bees are not very happy with me right now. So I think I'm going to cut my losses while I'm ahead.
Your indication that they're not happy is because they're flying around like that.
You see how they're all up in my face, all up in
Mm-hmm.
my grill.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to walk away. And usually if you walk away like 20 or 30 feet, they'll stop following you, usually.
So did you smell the bananas smell? Hannah said.
No, no, they hadn't gotten that, but like that's another indicator is when they're just like totally bouncing into your face.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
They just want to
So
be left
now,
alone for now. Is that the thing?
yeah, I mean, it's getting to be slightly overcast, and um, I was trying to do it without. Sometimes you can go with it in without smoke. Sometimes you can't. Um, and this was definitely a situation that smoke was probably a better option.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's just come back to questions. See if there's a few hanging on, but most of them are gone now.
Okay. Yeah. So does the honey need to be canned to save it from year to year?
No, honey. No, honey is totally shelf stable on its own. As long as so basically, sugar is essentially a natural preservative. That's why we can can jams, for instance. But like the honey, the sugar content of um, the sugar content of honey is just right to be shelf stable. So all you gotta do is put a lid on it, put it on the shelf. It's good to go.
Okay.
So um, I'm just trying to think of, there is much more to cover with how it works to keep bees.
Yeah.
And I want to, you know, give people. I was hoping to give people a general idea about what it takes. I guess I haven't talked about yet. What are your ongoing, like how often should you open the hive, and what is like the expectation in terms of maintenance. So
Mm-hmm.
let's talk about that for a minute, and then
Mm-hmm.
we can, and still questions are welcome.
Mm-hmm.
So once you have your hive set up, you should plan on checking in on it every. You should have an idea about what's going on in the hive weekly, but that doesn't mean you're opening the hive weekly. For a new beekeeper, I usually encourage people to open at least every 2 weeks. But in reality, we want to open the hive as little as possible. We're trying to let, set things up, let them do their thing, make sure they have enough space to expand into and to bring more honey, to creating more honey and drawing out more comb. Um, and then when it gets to the season where we're anticipating issues with pests, and we're monitoring for pests and making sure that's all good there, and then towards the end of the season, figuring out when the best time to harvest the honey is, and then other general maintenance things are, checking in that they're not too crowded, checking for any signs that there might be a swarm. If there's a presence of queen cells and it's capped, then you probably are going to have a swarm. And so what are you going to do about that? But, so essentially checking in on the hive once every couple of weeks, always having enough equipment on hand and ready to go to put on the next box, because if you go out there and it's clear that they need a box, but you don't have it set up, then that could be causing you problems with, there could be an issue that could lead to issues with swarms and such.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So James was asking, is there a beekeeping internship? And that's this Sweet on Detroit program we talked about, is canceled for this year, right? And we decided to go
Yeah.
ahead and cancel
Yeah.
that.
Let me just, okay, keep going.
Yeah. And so, typically applications come out, what is that, like January, February, for that beekeeping
Right.
program, beginner
Right.
beekeeping program, and it's a week by week
Right.
program. So be
Yeah.
on the lookout for that in 2021. We did cancel this year because of COVID concerns. And then a couple other questions here. Let's see, let me go back up to so can you speak a little bit about the mites? There's a few questions popping through. So can you speak to mites more?
Yes. So until about 20 years ago, beekeeping was a lot easier. There was, there were, some pest issues, but they weren't too bad. But then we had the introduction of what is called Varroa mites, Vorroa, Varroa mites, and they were imported from the Asian continent, and they are a pest pressure to a cousin of the honeybee that has a slightly different life cycle, that has adapted over time to, that those bees can survive just fine. But now that they've been, adapted, now that these mites have traveled overseas and are in the presence of our honeybees, their life cycle functions in such a way that they start out slow and they grow exponentially over the course of the population grows exponentially over the course of the season. And as the bee population is tapering down at the end of the season, the mite populations tend to go up. So there's regular monitoring that we are advised to do, which is a test you can do by taking a sampling of bees and putting them in a jar with powdered sugar, which shakes, basically knocks the bees off the backs of the, so we can get a sample of have a sense of the mite load, or the population of the mites in comparison to the population of the bees. And if there are, if there are 3 or more mites per 100 bees in your hive, then you have some serious problems, and essentially you're going to lose that hive. So in short, everybody's got mites on some level, and if people are not dealing with these mites, then you are going to lose your hives, and you're also putting your neighbors' hives at risk because of the way that they can travel, and the populations can grow. So we're trying to advocate for people to be proactive, and then when you know what your mite population is, then we advise one of the treatments out there. I'm not an advocate for using treatments and chemicals, but this is the main one that is used is called formic acid, which is a naturally occurring chemical. It's what fire ants have naturally occurring in their bodies, but this is concentrated into a patty that helps knock down the mite population. So essentially, once or likely twice each season, probably twice every year, we should be applying some kind of mite treatment to knock the population down. And good pest management practices are to make sure and test before you're doing, not to blanketly treat the bees, but to test them to know where you stand before you go ahead with doing any kinds of treatments. And there are some other pest issues, but not nearly as problematic.
Okay. And then another question is, how do you determine how much honey you keep to yourself versus how much the bees need, I guess?
Yes. So usually we advise that the hive goes into the winter with 2 full boxes of honey. So usually for the standard hive, the medium boxes, we'd want the hive to be usually the bottom 1 or 2 is where the bees are being raised, the brood nest, so to speak. And then above that, so the brood nest would live in these 2 boxes, and then honey would be, they would put honey in this box and the next one. So we probably want the hive to be 4 boxes high total, and then anything beyond that is what we can harvest for the season.
4 boxes high, and how many don't have frames in them? Just the one on top?
No, that just to clarify, that's not a regular. That's only when you're doing feeding on top. You don't always have to feed on top. Now that I'm just doing that because I just put those in. I know that there's a good nectar flow coming on now. We got dandelions Next week's looking pretty good for temperatures. So after that, we won't have that feeder box on top. It'll be just supers with frames in them.
Okay, so so Kyle's saying every time you fill up a comb with the eggs, right, then you're adding another box on top. Is that right?
Well, okay, let me do a little review because it's a lot. I know it's like, I was talking about eggs and it's kind of hard to get into the details, but these first two boxes, every box, hold on. No, this isn't a great example, but in any case, every box is going to have frames in it with foundation that they draw out wax on. The bottom two boxes is a shape of, it's kind of like the shape of a basketball in the center of it. If you could imagine that shape in the center is where the queen's doing all her work. She's laying eggs. The other workers are raising those eggs. And then on the edges of that, they're storing pollen and a little bit of honey. So that's the first two boxes. Above that is just these frames filled with honey. And that's just how it goes. There's the brood area, which is where the babies are being raised, and there's the food area, usually above that. Does that help?
Feel free to ask. Yes, Kyle says yes.
Okay.
And then I think you answered how to get rid of the mites in what you were saying.
Yeah.
And there's a little conversation. Thanks, Natalie, for chiming in, and Catherine, around like being good neighbors, and you're in an urban area, you're raising bees, and what can you do? And Natalie added a lot of insight in terms of just like notifying your neighbors and like maybe adding a tall fence. Anything you want to add to that conversation?
Yes. Well, technically, it's still illegal to keep bees in Detroit. Though the conversations that we've had with animal control is that the only time they're going to really come after you is if they have any kind of complaints. There is some draft information on an ordinance to allow for bees that's been kind of in the works for a few years now. But there's been some opposition, and the process has been kind of slow. But see, other things that I would recommend. It's a good thing to have the hive in a sunny location. And you also want to have set the hive up in a location that is not a lot of foot traffic. Consider maintenance around the hive. Does it need to be mowed? Or would you put wood chips down so you don't necessarily need to do maintenance there. Those are some of the main ones. Fence, yes, or some kind of wind block. But in terms of respect for neighbors, like I said, for the most part, they're not really going to wander too much into neighbors' yards, aside from going on flowers a bit. They're not aggressive. I've heard people talking about complaints with bees in their pool, but that's probably about the extent of it. Okay.
So a couple questions on that. Any tips for how we can help get the ordinance passed, Kyle saying, and then you are saying that it's technically illegal to have the hives, right?
Yes.
And then anything that folks can do, gardeners can do to advocate for beekeeping?
Well, I guess I would say we are trying to keep our finger on the pulse of what is going on. And
Yeah.
as developments come about, we can communicate, like, if there be an appropriate time to come to a hearing or write a letter. But as it stands, I don't have any direct suggestions at this point.
Yeah, it's been a long process, so we'll
Yeah.
definitely try to keep you guys.
And one of the things that we like, it's, well, I think it deserves a little bit of clarification. It's technically not, it's not like chickens and goats, where chickens and goats are illegal, like it's in the language. Um, bees are in a slight nebulous space where it's technically not legal and it's technically not illegal. There's not verbiage that says specifically do not keep bees or this type of livestock.
Mhm.
Um, and there has been, we've had some friends who are bee club members who are lawyers looking at some of the recommended guidelines. And there's been a lot, and feedback is like, if we agree to these guidelines, then they're going to be regulated and maybe more strictly regulated than we have now. So maybe we just don't we just rather function without that kind of regulation. So it's complicated to think about.
Yeah.
Um, do we want to have a by right of this, this is my right to do this, but we don't want animal, but do we want animal control coming to our house and saying, well, your beehives are too close to your neighbor's yard, so you have to move them. So it still needs to be sorted out.
Mhm. Okay, so we're right at 2:30, and if there's any final questions, I want to make sure we get to them. I know we do have a few call-in listeners. Feel free to raise your hand if you have questions and you're calling in. If you have other questions, throw them in the chat box. So give folks a couple more minutes to ask any questions. Again, I'll send out the slides and those couple of documents that Keto recommended, and there was a video that you usually have folks watch. I'll send that out as well. Any final thoughts, Keto, or?
Well, my email is at the last slide. So if you have particular questions or things that I didn't cover, I know we tried to cover a lot of ground in a small amount of time today. So please feel free to email me with questions or how I might be helpful. And also email me if you'd like to be get information about the B class next year when applications come out. Classes are the beginner class is 6 classes. It actually usually starts today. The end of April, and it goes through June on Saturdays. And I do have some other resources for first year beekeeping. If that's something of interest to you, you can feel free to reach out about that.
Yeah, Carla mentioned she might try to keep this year, so was asking for a part 2 of this maybe. And I would suggest that you shoot an email to Keto, because he's going to be organizing some Zoom meetings for the Bee Club that we help coordinate in the city, and that might be a good place to join in and get some questions answered. Yeah, a lot of people saying they enjoyed the webinar. It was great. And then, okay, so a couple of GRP questions. Where can I go to pick up compost? Can I pick it up today? James, yes. If you have, I don't want to send a link out here because there's folks who aren't in the Garden Resource Program. So technically, compost is for members of the Garden Resource Program. I can send you a link to those sites. But if you're familiar with the 3 regional hubs that we have traditionally worked with, there's compost at all 3, East Side, Northwest, and Central. And so if you send an email to info@keepgrowingdetroit.org, I can send you those addresses for those sites. Those are all self-serve. You'll bring your shovel and you'll load up by yourself. Yep. Keto's email is just Keto, KIDO, @keepgrowingdetroit.org. I'll also CC him on the email that goes out with these slides so that you can respond with questions directly to him. Folks saying great class. Nice job, Keto. Thanks, Danielle, behind the scenes.
Bye, guys.
We'll bye. Take care.